Welcome to Lesson 1-5, Day 1, Measuring in Metric Units. Today we're going to talk about how to choose and use the appropriate metric units. First, we have to understand what is the metric system. The metric system is a system of measurement that uses decimals. So when we measure, we use the customary system, so we don't typically use decimals, but in this system you'll tend to see 1 and 3/10 centimeters or 10 and 5/10 kilometers. So in order to choose the appropriate units of measurement, we first have to know what all of them are. So common metric units of length. Now length, remember, answers the question of how long. So these are the units you would use to measure how long something is. So the first unit that we have is millimeter. Many of us remember that the abbreviation for millimeter is 2 lowercase m's. The benchmark for a millimeter, so what this means is this is something that you can judge or guess your answer with. So the benchmark for a millimeter is the thickness of a dime. So if you were to take this dime and look at it sideways, the thickness of that dime is about a millimeter. So the benchmark is something that you can think back to try and decide if you want to use this unit of measurement or not. This helps you when you do not have a ruler right in front of you, which in the most cases we don't. Centimeter. The centimeter abbreviation is lowercase c, lowercase m, and the benchmark for centimeter is half the width of a penny. So if you're looking at this penny head on, halfway through Abe Lincoln would be a centimeter. And then we have meter, which is just a lowercase m, which would make sense. The centimeter, millimeters, so this is just meter. The benchmark for a meter is the width of a doorway. Right, so when you're walking in the door, not the door itself, but the distance between the one side of the door and the other side of the frame of the door. And then we have kilometer or kilometer. KM would be the abbreviation for that. And again, I don't mind which way you say it. My main concern is that you know when to use it. And a kilometer is about 6 city blocks. So when you're thinking about city blocks, think of when you're walking to a friend's house and you're going from the start of a sidewalk to the end of the sidewalk, and that's usually 1 block, and then there's a street in between, and then there's a new sidewalk. So that sidewalk to the end would be 2 blocks. So 6 blocks would be a kilometer. It's important to remember that when we measure, reading rulers is very important. You have to pay attention because some of our rulers have centimeters on one side and inches on the other. So in this case, we're going to be working with the centimeter side of a ruler. This ruler is marked using centimeters. Sometimes your ruler will say that it's millimeters because each of these small hashes are millimeters, and then each big number is a centimeter. If you're unsure, you can always bring it up and ask myself or another teacher just to confirm that you're using the right units. Right, so if we're looking at that and each of these is a millimeter, then how many millimeters equal 1 centimeter? You can use this ruler to try and find your answer. If you counted and said that 10 millimeters equals 1 centimeter, you would be correct. Later on, we'll talk about why this makes measurement in the metric system and converting in the metric system so much less complicated than in the customary system. All right, so measure the length of this pencil in centimeters, then in millimeters. One of the first things that you need to make sure to do is make sure that you line up your object with the 0 mark on your ruler. So often we see students just put the pencil to the edge of the ruler. You have to make sure to line it up with the 0. Sometimes the 0 is on the edge, sometimes it's not. So you have to pay attention and know how your ruler works. Right, so when we look at this, we see that this pencil, the tip of the pencil, comes down right about there. So we would say that this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 centimeters. And then each of these hash marks is a tenth. So this is 12 and 1/10, 12 and 2/10, 12 and 3/10, 12 and 4/10. So this would be 12 and 4/10 centimeters long. Now if we want to measure it in millimeters, instead of counting 1 at each of these, we would count 10 because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, but now instead of counting these as tenths, we have to continue to count them as ones. So this is 121, 122, 123, 124 centimeters. I'm sorry, millimeters. You'll notice that the centimeters and the millimeters, the numbers stay the same, it's just the decimal that moves. We'll talk more about this in tomorrow's lesson. All right, so let's go ahead and try measuring these objects. Remember, we have to put the 0 on the edge of the picture. Okay, so before I was talking about this, this would be incorrect. This doesn't start your measurement in the right place. So we just need to start on the 0, and then we need to count. We're doing it in centimeters, then in millimeters. So we know we have 3 centimeters, and then it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tenths. So it's 3 and 6/10 centimeters. And then if we're counting in millimeters, we're counting 10, 20, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36 millimeters. All right, so what I'm going to do here, I know that you do not have this part in your notes, but I just want to remind you that it's important to line up your measurements on the 0. Right, so you can take the opportunity to try and look at this. You can pause and try to figure out what the measurement of the truck is. When you come back, you can check your answer. If you want to write it down, you can. Otherwise, you do not have to. All right, so your answer for the truck, you would have had 53 millimeters and 5 and 3/10 centimeters. I'm going to go ahead and line up the crayon. Take a minute, pause, and see if you can figure out how long this is in centimeters and in millimeters. If you said 80 millimeters and 8 centimeters, you would be correct. All right, moving on to mass. When we talk about units of mass, mass answers how heavy an object is. So when you're talking about how heavy something is, we're talking about grams as the main unit. So we use milligrams, and the abbreviation for that would be lowercase m. So milli always uses that lowercase m, just like we used in millimeter. And then gram uses the lowercase g. So mg is going to mean milligram. The benchmark for a milligram is a grain of salt. So one of those little grains of salt that comes out of the salt shaker would have the mass of about 1 milligram. That's actually very tiny if you think about it. A gram would have the abbreviation of a lowercase g. And the benchmark for gram would be a small paper clip. And then kilogram would be kg, and the benchmark for a kilogram would be the math textbook that you have and have worked with, or even your science textbook. Okay, please make sure that you're filling these out as we go. This is something that will be very useful to you when you're working on your work in class later on. The other thing that I want to point out, you'll remember that when we worked on units of length, that we talked about centimeters. Okay, so here we did use the prefix centi. We do not use those as a common unit for mass. So when we're talking about choosing the most appropriate unit to use, you're only using the units that I'm giving you. So if you put down centigram as an answer, it's going to be incorrect because you don't know the benchmark for a centigram. Those aren't what we're working with. We're just working with usually the three main units. In the metric system, we usually just work with milli, the unit, and kilo. All the in-betweens are used less often. But when you're working with the units of length, the centimeter is actually a fairly common unit to use. Okay, last but not least, we have units of capacity. Capacity means how much can it hold. So when you're talking about capacity, the main unit there is liter. So when we're talking about 1 milliliter, we're talking about what comes out of an eyedropper. Okay, so it's not a lot. It's a very small amount, but the amount that can fit in an eyedropper is about 1 milliliter. Again, your abbreviation would be the lowercase m. In this case, we use a capital L for liter. And then liter, your base unit, is going to be equal to a small pitcher. Again, using the capital L. And then a kiloliter, again lowercase k but a capital L, is going to equal about 5 bathtubs. So imagine taking your bathtub and multiplying it in size by 5. That would be about 1 kiloliter. It would hold about 1 kiloliter, would be more of a correct statement. Okay, so now that you know your units, we're going to talk about how to select the appropriate unit. So when you're selecting a metric unit, you want to start with the largest unit. Okay? If the object is too small to use those units, try the next smaller unit. And then you continue this until you find a unit that is just right or close enough to measure your object. So what I mean by this, and again, don't forget to fill that out, okay? So when selecting a metric unit, try using the largest unit. If the object is too small, use those units, try the next smaller unit. So for example, in this one you can just watch. This one is not in your notes. For example, I'm working with a tennis ball. Okay, so if we're working with the mass of a tennis ball, then we're working with grams because we're talking about how heavy the tennis ball is. Remember, we want to start with the largest unit. So the largest unit of mass, we can go back and check, would be the kilogram. So the largest unit of mass is a kilogram. That's equal to about a math book. I think a tennis ball is not going to be as heavy as your math book, so the kilogram would be too heavy. Okay, we wouldn't want to measure. That tells us that using a kilogram to measure the tennis ball would be too much. So we go on to the next unit. So now we look and we say, all right, the next smallest unit was gram. Gram had a benchmark of a paperclip. Now, a paperclip is very tiny. However, we can use lots of paperclips to measure up to that tennis ball. The tennis ball is not too heavy for that paperclip. So the appropriate unit of measurement to use for the tennis ball would be the gram. Now that you've had an opportunity to work through it with me, I want you to try this problem on your own. Pause. When you come back, we'll go over your answer. Right, so we're talking about the amount of juice in a raspberry. So if it's the amount of juice in something, we're talking about capacity. And capacity means that we're working with liters. Since we're working with liters, the biggest unit for liters would be the kiloliter. And I apologize, that doesn't look like a lowercase k. Kiloliters. The kiloliter is 5 bathtubs. I don't think that we're going to need 5 bathtubs to measure the amount of juice in 2 raspberries. The next smallest would be a liter. The liter is the size of a small pitcher. I still think that a small pitcher would have been too big to hold or to measure the amount of juice in 2 raspberries. It could hold that much juice, but it wouldn't be an appropriate standard of measurement to use. The next unit was the milliliter. The milliliter is about an eyedropper full. So the milliliter would be about just right to measure how much juice is in 2 raspberries. Okay, now that we've done this together, I want you to try the rest of these on your own. This is what you're going to post to Edmodo. Right, so what I want you to do when you post, you're going to write depth of the, so when you're typing, this is what I would see as your post. So for the first one, I'm going to make this white so you can actually see it. So if you're typing in your answer for depth of the ocean, you would write depth of the ocean. You could just put a dash in there, and you could put, if you chose kilometers, that's how you would show me that. So I should have that for each one of these. So you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different answers in your one post. And each one you need to write out what the object is and what you're going to use to measure it. If you have any questions, make sure to post them to Edmodo so we can go over them in class tomorrow.